I remember waking up in the middle of the night, sweating. You see, when I was a kid, I was afraid of the dark. And it wasn't just the dark, but what I believe waited beyond what I could see. When it's dark, every other sense intensifies. The noises, the vibrations, all of it. We grow up afraid of things that go bump in the night. Our imaginations run wild with boogeymen and monsters lurking in the shadows. But we grow up and discover that monsters aren't real until they are. I can't imagine the terror Betty and Kathryn felt when they realized behind that knock-knock on September 3rd, 1990, stood a monster. Along with the sheer panic Betty felt as she screamed Kathryn's name, I suspect she was also overcome with confusion. What did this man want? What did she do wrong? Why is he so angry? I hate that Mama Betty's last moments on Earth were face to face with a living, breathing nightmare. Even as a child, I learned what the monsters fear. Whether imaginary or real, monsters today still fear the light. And today, we are that light. We will not stop until we bring light to every corner of this story. And with your help and enough light, we will find the monster.
Homicide. Thanks for joining us.
Second story of my
and Miss Betty Jones were brutally murdered inside
Betty
Kathryn's
Jones
home on
and
Labor Day
Kathryn Krigler
1990.
were murdered on September 3rd, 1990. Their killer has never been found.
5 years ago, two women were murdered in Starkville, and their killer has never been caught.
In partnership with Swell Story Media, this is Knock Knock, the unsolved murders of Betty Jones and Kathryn Krigler. My name is Jason B. Jones.
Starkville Daily News, August 28, 2015. Starkville police, responding to public request, is hoping to jog some memories of the suspect in the 1990 Labor Day murder of Betty Jones. The department released a picture Thursday based on a sketch artist rendering of the unknown suspect from a description by Kathryn Krigler. A week ago, police asked for public help on a new lead in the unsolved murder. A new DNA test turned up two family names, Hicks and Devine. What this means is that the suspect DNA profile is in some way related to both family names, but what that specific relationship is not known. Carly Preachard in the Investigation Division of the Starkville Police Department said in a news release, between 7 p.m. and 10 p.m. on Labor Day 1990, a man entered the Krigler residence at 307 Lee Street, now Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Drive, and killed Betty Jones, according to police. He also raped and assaulted Kathryn Krigler, who was able to call 911. She was taken to the hospital and gave police a description before she died. Ms. Krigler identified the suspect as a white male with blonde hair and blue eyes and very tan complexion at the time of the crime, the news release said. At that time, the killer was believed to be between 16 and 28 years old. A rape kit provided DNA that showed the killer to be about 90% white European descent, about 10% Native American, and possibly partial Jewish ancestry, according to the news release. Krigler's description to sketch artist Robert Bunky Williams, developed by the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, was shown on America's Most Wanted in 1993. It has since been updated to show how a suspect might look today. Anyone with information about the crime is asked to call Starkville Police Sergeant Bill Lott at 662-323-4131.
Sharon, my wife, and I had seen Betty around 5 o'clock or 4:30 or 5 o'clock that evening at the local Kroger grocery store. We were doing our shopping, and she was in there shopping, and we had a little talk, and she told me she was going to spend the night with Kathryn Krigler. This was around 5 o'clock that evening, and that she was going to listen to the Mississippi State baseball game, because you know what a big fan she was of Mississippi State baseball, and that she was going over to Kathryn's because Kathryn wasn't doing well, and she was telling me because she wanted me to come check on Kathryn in a day or two to see how she was doing. But she was going to spend the night and maybe the whole weekend with her to make sure she was okay.
It was Nita, her sister-in-law, who stayed with her the night before. And then I think she was up all night long with her. They had had no sleep. And because Betty Jones was a dear, dear, dear friend of my granny's, I think Aunt Nita called Betty to see if she would stay the night. And that if she'd do that she'd come the next night until, she was okay.
So she had a housekeeper that I believe was at her home every day during the daytime hours and possibly stayed overnight with her a few nights per week.
As I began to research this case, details of what happened to my grandmother, Betty Jones, and her friend Kathryn Crickler were hard to come by. It seemed like every question I asked was met with either a dead end or more questions. I did know that this terrible event happened on Labor Day evening, September 3rd, 1990, in the small town of Starkville, Mississippi. Starkville is mostly known for being the home of Mississippi State University and is the town where most of my family is originally from. Kathryn's house, where the murder occurred, was located on Highway 82, now Martin Luther King Jr. Drive, one street over from downtown Starkville and Betty and Kathryn's church, First Presbyterian. Being such a small town, information in 1990 was mostly distributed by either the Starkville Daily newspaper, the nearby Columbus, Mississippi TV affiliate, if your antenna was good enough, and oftentimes word of mouth. As I quickly realized, 1990 was a very analog era. So finding details online was almost non-existent. Even now, if you Google this crime, you'll find there isn't much there. So the hunt for answers began.
Back then, technology 27 years ago is not what it is today. And when I was working at the SDN, we were still using 12-inch floppy disks to save our files, and I think we had 2 Macs that we put the paper together on every day. It was a big story. And it was a big story for a number of months, especially in a town like Starkville. Back in 1990, you really didn't have the 24-hour news cycle like you do now. And this was obviously a very a case that held a lot of the community's interest. It was a mystery. Who committed the Labor Day murder? We did like to listen to the police, keep the police scanner and the fire scanner on in the newsroom, so if something happened. But this being a night, there was nobody at the newspaper, especially on Labor Day. And I want to say I just caught that the next day. The Starkville Daily definitely took the lead in reporting on this story. That not a lot of, there's no local TV in Starkville, and I don't think the closest TV station, I guess, anybody watched would have been out of Tupelo. And I want to say they ran a couple of pieces on it. We were definitely the main source of information about the case. Computers were a lot slower. We didn't have the internet. It was a different time, and so it was definitely that made things that much harder. It was really old school police work.
For me, investigating anything, especially a 27-year-old murder, was way out of my wheelhouse. I'm an artist by trade and work in the music business designing album covers and producing music videos. But as a true crime podcast fan, I've learned to start with what's simple and work my way out. So I started with what I knew. First, I talked to my mom and dad, Bill and Colleen Jones, about what happened that night.
Oh, I was in shock. I was hurt. I was painful. I was questioning why this happened, But you can't think about that at the moment. You have to think about getting there, helping other people, making sure everybody's safe, everybody's got everything they need, and then what you need comes last. Colleen asked where you could put the children to sleep, so they got you and your brother down for the night, and while Colleen was getting you down for the night, Steve and I were talking about what happened, and trying to talk through it. And then the next morning, we got up and went to the funeral home.
In those days, it was about a 12-hour drive. If you were really strong, you just pushed through, or sometimes you would stop along the way, and I think we pushed through, just taking turns driving. We got there in the middle of the night, and everybody in the family that we had talked to was very much asleep and locked in their houses. So we called Dad's best friend from high school and college, who was one of the pastors at Betty's church, and he and his family lived outside the city limits. So we got directions from them. We had to find a payphone to call them. The fact that he left Miss Krigler alive and she was able to give her statement to the police is all that we have.
I also got an account from one of Betty's pastors and my dad's childhood friend, Steve Davis.
And then he came in when he finished with Betty and began to beat her and do things to her. Miss Krigler, even though she died several months later, she was also, in a true sense, murdered by the same person because he beat her to a pulp. He really did. He didn't cut her the way he did Betty, but he beat her up, and she eventually died.
I knew I needed more than just stories. I needed to start collecting documented facts. If only I had articles from the days after the crime to read through, I feel like I would learn so much more. Thankfully, I found Ben Nagel, who knew much more about going through archives than I did.
Your grandmother, Jones, was at Krigler's house, and all we have to go on is Krigler's account. She heard that she was being called for help. Your grandmother had been attacked, and then Miss Krigler was attacked, and then the man fled.
Growing up, I vividly remember watching Mama Betty's story on America's Most Wanted. Our old VHS recording had long been lost. But maybe, if I reach out to the studio, they could send me a copy from their vaults.
Good evening from Washington. I'm John Walsh.
And they had previews of upcoming shows that were coming on, and we found out that the one that we were the most interested in was going to be on. And we were excited because this was the first national attention that had happened in over 3 years since Betty had died. And maybe we were finally going to find out something. Maybe somebody was going to call in. Maybe there were going to be some clues to what had happened. At least it got the point across to the nation that this was a real case that hadn't been solved and we needed help. And hopefully somebody that knew something would call in. They had a much better picture of the murderer than what we had ever seen before in the newspaper. Technology had progressed by this time so that they could make a composite which actually looked like a photograph. It was amazing, but sadly, nothing came along that helped the case any, as far as we know. If any leads were called in, they went cold.
There are a few other things police know about the killer. He's probably in his mid-20s to early 30s, and he's about 5 foot 10 inches tall. If you have any information which you think might help police, please call us at 1-800-CRIME.
For months, I had gathered everything I could and spoken to anyone and everyone who would talk with me. But the well was growing dry. I knew that what I needed to do was to go visit Starkville and see where everything happened to start to understand. Little did I know how much I would find when I got there. First time here in 27 years, and I definitely wasn't driving the last time I was here. I imagine I was in the back seat playing games, asking, are we there yet? You know, it's funny how cities change. I imagine this is nothing like the Starkville that Betty grew up in. So my only recollection of this church was I remember vaguely walking into it, and Betty's funeral was standing room only. There were people waiting outside to get in. I mean, you just think about how different it is compared to probably the way it was in September of 1990. And you just think about like how much of these two women's lives occupied this piece of land. I just feel overwhelmed here. It's not even sadness, it's just, there's just a magnitude, I don't know, it's hard to describe. I don't know if Betty ever would have thought that that I would have been here, that I would be here right now, and that I would be at the same door that the killer took to. I guess, just being here, I feel like I understand how scary that would have been. The phone was right here on the wall. So in my understanding, because she was wheelchair bound, she crawled and pulled herself into the kitchen. And then, back in the day, phones had cords. And so there was a long cord hanging down, and she was able to pull that down and call 911. And that's the 911 call that we've heard on the America's Most Wanted episode. Let's take a quick break. While living in Ethiopia, some friends of mine witnessed firsthand the consequences of extreme poverty. They saw how the Ethiopian women, in an effort to provide for themselves and their families, were forced to make unthinkable choices just to survive. These friends realized they wanted to give these women another choice, one that would provide them the opportunity to earn a living. It was from this experience that Fashionable was born. This movement started with a collection of hand-woven scarves, of which my wife has many, and has grown to include handmade leather bags and jewelry, apparel, shoes, and most recently, a premium denim line, lovingly crafted by women who have overcome extraordinary circumstances. We're so honored to partner with Fashionable and offer our listeners 15% off their first order. Go to livefashionable.com and use the discount code KNOCK15 at checkout. Again, visit livefashionable.com today to help bring opportunity and choice to these amazing women. Two amazing things happened while I was in Starkville. The first was meeting Sergeant Bill Lott. By day, Sergeant Lott works faithfully for the Starkville Police Department. For years, he's been using his nights and weekends to investigate this case and leads the charge towards finding justice for Betty and Kathryn.
Fortunately, with this case, it boils down to this. In 1990, he came in the house, and he goes in there, and he after he kills Betty, and he rapes Kathryn Krigler.
Betty is a good person, She was a good member of her church. She was a mother to the baseball team. I mean, it's just not right. It's just not fair. And it just stinks that life is... not fair. It's not, and I want it to be fair, and I want it to be soft for her.
The second was meeting Mr. Ray Gillespie. Mr. Gillespie owns the house where my grandmother was killed. All I knew when I got to Starkville was the Kriglers sold the house shortly after the crime. But I had no idea who owned the house now until I knocked on the door.
Yeah. They came in that door right there, and they say, somehow the lady that was in here got the phone and had a long cord on, so she crawled.
Growing up, I always knew that Mama Betty was killed with a lady named Kathryn. However, I didn't know anything about her. This story was as much about her as it was about Betty. I knew I needed to speak with her family and hear what Kathryn told them in the 2 short months that she survived.
My mother and Betty Jones was spending the night at my mother's house because my mother was sick and she needed somebody to care for her during that period of time. And they were planning to watch on Labor Day evening a game, I guess, with the San Francisco Giants, which featured Will Clark, one of the several All-Americans who had played at Mississippi State during that period of time. But before that could get started, they had a knock on the back door, and fella came in and took Betty's life with a knife.
That's Shep Krigler. He's Kathryn's son.
In my recollection, it was the preacher of the church who called on Labor Day evening, but we had gone to bed.
We were asleep.
We were asleep, and
that's Ann Krigler. She was Kathryn's daughter-in-law.
He told us about what had happened, and we didn't plan to go right then because it was like about 9:30, 10 o'clock or later than that, and we hadn't any arrangements made for our children. So we just decided that we would go over the next morning, and that's what we did. We tried to sleep that night, but it didn't come very easy. You know? Well, it's like that somebody had broken into the house and had killed Betty and had attacked our mother. She had lived and was now at the hospital. It was assumed at that time that that a person, a male, made his way over to the back of our house, which is where most of the time we came into the house, you know, the carport back there and so on, which is still there, and that he knocked on the door, rang the doorbell. I don't know whether there was a doorbell on that door or not. Now, we never used it, of course, but that Betty went to the door, and that was when the murder actually occurred. He apparently had a pocket knife that he pulled out somewhere between the back door and that room. And I was told after all of this happened, and upon the examination of the knife, that it was an extremely sharp knife blade and so forth. And he pulled it out, and there is a conjecture that this is what he used to kill Betty, and that he had cut her, I don't know, but some main arteries in her throat, and there was blood all over that room. And my mother had gotten out of the bed, had crawled on the floor from the bedroom into the kitchen and talked on the phone. We managed to pull the phone off the hook while she called, 911. And the police came directly to the carport, and policeman spotted my mother through a kitchen window sitting on the kitchen floor waiting for someone to come. And he broke into a window that was on the part of the window, that he was looking through into the house to see that something had really bad happened.
Your name is Miss Krigler? Yes. Tonight there was one single boy, young man, and he went in the front room where my friend was. He came back in with his hands all bloody, and then he raped me. I know I did. It's just terrible.
Now I had heard it was a box cutter, so I don't know. You hear so many things, but.
Somebody knocked on the door, and the next thing she knew, they had just taken their baths, they had on their nightgowns, and they were getting ready to watch Golden Girls. I know that's what she told me. Somebody knocked on the door, which was on the side door, and no one came to the side door. It was just like a side patio that we would, rock on this glider, I can remember, but nobody ever came to that side door.
That's Juki Krigler Holt, who we spoke with last time. She was Kathryn's granddaughter.
She told me that she was sitting in her wheelchair and that he took her out of the wheelchair and threw her back on the bed, and that he even forced her to keep her eyes open and put her hands above her head, and he raped her. And that he probably just left her to lie on the bed dying because she was bleeding so badly internally. Even after this event, my granny lived for only 2 more months, and she too never wanted to go back into that house. It was just terrible to watch, and I think she just gave up, and that just wasn't her, but I think for something like that to have happened, it sucked the life out of her. When my granny, after she was out of the hospital and was told about Betty, I'm sure that she had that weight and responsibility on her too. I really do. That a responsibility of her being there that she couldn't bear, that wouldn't have happened.
Starkville Daily News, November 13th, 1990. The sole witness to the unsolved Labor Day murder of a Starkville woman died at her home Sunday. Starkville police officials said Monday, Kathryn Crumpton Krigler, 81, died of natural causes at her home at approximately 6 p.m., police said. An autopsy is not expected to be performed. Ms. Krigler was the only known witness to the September 3rd murder of 65-year-old Betty Jones. Jones had her throat cut during an apparent robbery attempt at Ms. Krigler's house at 306 Martin Luther King Jr. Drive, late Labor Day night. Ms. Krigler, who was confined to a wheelchair, was also attacked in the incident and was left for dead at the scene. Ms. Krigler had apparently never fully recovered from the trauma of the incident and had been in poor health ever since. The murder is still under investigation, with local and state law enforcement agencies, as well as the FBI, called in on the case. It seems like everything has happened to hinder the investigation that could have, from rumors to Ms. Krigler's death. Starkville Police Chief H.B. Maxey said Monday, it is currently unclear how Ms. Krigler's death will affect the case, although Maxey said her death should have little impact on the investigation. Police have made no arrest in this case.
Let's take another quick break. If there's one thing I've learned about Betty through this process, is that her life was dedicated to giving back. I know she would have loved organizations like Thistle Farms. At first glance, Thistle Farms is a world-class provider of natural home and body products. In the summertime, their bug spray is a must. But what is truly amazing about these items are the people who make them. All of Thistle Farms products are lovingly crafted by women, survivors of trafficking, prostitution, and addiction. You see, beneath the surface, what Thistle Farms really is a place that provides safe housing, economic independence, and a strong community of advocates for these women. Take a minute to visit thistlefarms.org and learn more about this amazing organization. And while you're there, use the discount code KNOCK15 for 15% off your first order. That's thistlefarms.org, where love is the most powerful force for change in the world. So here's what we know. Kathryn was an 81-year-old amputee who was confined to a wheelchair. Betty, who was 65, went over to Kathryn's house to spend the night with her. Between 8 and 10 p.m., someone knocked on the side door, an entrance only usually used by friends and family. Betty let the intruder in. She was overcome by the intruder, and her throat was cut. She died there in the front room of Kathryn's house. The intruder, covered in Betty's blood, moved on to Kathryn. He picked her up out of the wheelchair and violently raped and assaulted her on the bed. The intruder left Kathryn for dead and vanished into the night. Sometime later that evening, Kathryn pulled herself into the kitchen where the corded phone was located and called 911. She waited there for the police and was taken to the hospital. Since episode 1 came out on September 3rd, people have graciously reached out wanting to share their stories and accounts. And not just friends of Betty and Kathryn, but experts in the fields of DNA, forensics, and cold case research. It's funny. I recently had a friend ask me, how many episodes do you have recorded? The answer is none. This is not fiction. There is no pre-written narrative or ending. This story is happening in real time. And as I've said before, you are coming with me. As I learn and discover, you will too. As we get closer to finding the killer, you will be there with me. We're on this road together. And together, with some luck, we will find peace and justice for Betty and Kathryn. Next time on Knock Knock.
She was a very active Mississippi State alumnus, and she was, like I said, loved baseball and was active in all the different, going to the sporting events, and knew a lot of people who were very closely connected to Mississippi State from all over the state. Plus, she was very active in the church, knew everybody in the church, in the community. She was very active in the community. She was one of the pink ladies at the hospital.
Betty was the type of person that made everyone feel immediately welcome and close to her heart, even in a room full of strangers. When she was younger than 2, I think she was around 18 months old, she was tragically killed in a car accident.
Knock Knock is produced by Chris Cerrone and me. Special thanks to the Knock Knock team, Lacey Orcioli, Rebecca Jones, Jason Adams, Simon Jones, Cole Flynn, Colleen Jones, and Maggie Thomas. To join the Knock Knock community, be sure and connect with me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Knock Knock Pod. There you can ask questions, leave comments, or just say hi. We've also set up a voicemail at 1-888-57-BETTY. If you have comments or questions, or you'd like to be a part of the show, please call and leave a message. You can also rate and review the show on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you download podcasts. Reviews are key to keeping Knock Knock on the charts where people can find our show. Our outro music was provided by my friend and one of my favorite artists, Matthew Perriman Jones. To listen to more of his music, please visit mpjmusic.com. We'll be back in 2 weeks with our next full episode, and we'll post a quick Q&A episode between now and then. So make sure and get your questions and comments in soon. Thanks again for subscribing to the Knock Knock Podcast.